Let me take you back to mid-century Manhattan, where a little girl named Susan Kerr Weld began her journey on August 27th, 1943. It wasn't a Tuesday, it was a Friday. Yet she eventually became known to the world as Tuesday Weld, and her life story is one wild ride of triumph, heartbreak, scandal, and survival. Hollywood is known for child actors who grow up too quickly, but Tuesday took that concept to a whole new level. The scandals that swirled around her made people uneasy, though her undeniable spark still turned her into a true star. For a time, that spark also made her life spiral out of control, with every slip of gossip feeding her rebellious image. She was a paradox, a fragile soul thrust into a very adult world, yet a fierce personality unafraid to buck convention. By the time she was only 10, she had endured more pain and carried more weight on her shoulders than most adults do in their entire lives. The tabloids saw her as a bad girl. Hollywood saw her as a nymphet, and audiences couldn't take their eyes off her. Even now, decades later, her name continues to intrigue us. She was born into a family with a storied name on her father's side. The Weld clan came from old money, people who inhabited an elite world of security and privilege. But Tuesday's father, named Lathrop Motley Weld, was far from being the jewel of the family. A struggling man with a reputation for poor judgment, he was the proverbial black sheep. He drank too much, made some scandalous choices, and apparently found it difficult to hold on to any stability. He got married multiple times, Tuesday's mother being his fourth wife. The only time Lathrop seemed to benefit from his family background was when he managed to tap into the Weld fortune, though that line of credit was never guaranteed. Thus, Tuesday spent her earliest years in a precarious balance. The name Weld carried an aura of wealth and sophistication, yet the actual day-to-day finances were always on the brink of disaster. When Tuesday was just about 4 years old, her father died suddenly, leaving her mother, Yosine, alone with 3 children. The money from the family's fortune was no longer coming her way, at least not without severe conditions, and it fell on Tuesday's mother to figure out how to keep everyone afloat. At one point, they lived in a cold water flat in a rundown area of Manhattan, barely scraping by. The extended Weld clan looked on from their plush lives in Tuxedo Park and offered a solution that came with a catch so cruel it's almost unimaginable. They told Tuesday's mother, "We'll take the kids, give them the best education, pay for everything they need, but you'll never see them again." They felt that Yosine was unworthy, thinking she had come from disreputable stock even though she was related to a well-known illustrator and even to Alexander Graham Bell. The fact that she was once an orphan, in their minds, made her unacceptable. In a twist that speaks to the complicated bond between a mother and her children, Yosine refused. She would rather stay impoverished and risk daily hardships than give up her kids. That single decision changed the entire course of Tuesday's childhood. The newly widowed and utterly desperate mother realized that her daughter Susan, the future Tuesday, had a remarkable face. She was truly photogenic and quite charming when she wanted to be. Desperate times called for desperate measures, and that meant pushing her little girl into modeling. Before Susan had turned 10, her life revolved around auditioning for jobs that might pay a few dollars, enough to keep food on the table. The emotional burden on that tiny girl was unthinkable. She was going to these auditions not as a hobby or a fun pastime, but because the rent depended on it. On top of that, her mother relied heavily on Susan for her own emotional support, seeing her as a kind of replacement husband and father figure. Before she was even in middle school, Susan was buckling under a weight that would be too heavy for most adults. Inevitably, at 9 years old, she suffered a complete nervous breakdown. The pressure the lack of a real childhood, and the knowledge that she was the breadwinner for a family of four took a brutal toll on her mind. For a brief period, her mother attempted to lighten the load by moving the family to Fort Lauderdale so that Susan might live a slightly more normal life. It was too little, too late. By the time she was 10, she had already discovered that alcohol numbed her pain in the short term. It's heartbreaking to imagine a small child turning to drink. Yet there she was, a broken little girl with the responsibilities of an adult who found that self-medicating seemed like the only option. Her mother soon realized that they needed a steady stream of income once again. Tuesday was yanked back to New York to continue her modeling career and possibly break into television and film. Her earliest roles were minor bits. At age 12, she landed a spot in a television series, and in the same year, 1956, the legendary Alfred Hitchcock gave her a cameo in The Wrong Man, in which she appeared as a giggling adolescent. One might think this was a dream come true, but for Tuesday, it was just another burden. Her personal life was in disarray, her mental health was fragile, and she had recently discovered not only alcohol but pills to help her cope. On top of that, she had begun exploring romance. She would later claim that she had her first affair at age 11 and tried to take her own life at 12 because she'd fallen in love with a gay man. These are shocking admissions, the kind that revealed just how bleak her early adolescence really was. One day, her mother found her unconscious and rushed her to the hospital, where doctors realized Tuesday had overdosed in an attempt to end her life. She went into a coma and upon waking found that her vision and hearing had temporarily vanished. She desperately pleaded for professional help, for counseling, therapy, anything, but her mother refused, continuing instead to push Tuesday forward in show business. Tuesday's first real leading role was in a jukebox musical titled Rock, Rock, Rock. The main selling point of the film was that it featured a bunch of popular singers performing tunes that were already radio hits. Tuesday's presence, however, caught the attention of one critic who famously labeled her the archetypal nymphette. She was playing a teenager, but the undertones of sexuality in her performance were jarring, especially when you realize she was actually only about 12 years old during filming. To make matters worse, her on-screen boyfriend was played by a 21-year-old man, which emphasized just how surreal her career had become. Audiences saw something in her that was both innocent and provocatively experienced beyond her years, a mix that spelled trouble for many viewers and for producers who had to figure out how to market her. In 1958, she and her mother relocated to Hollywood so that Tuesday could film Rally Round the Flag Boys, where she played a teen named Comfort Goodpasture. It was a family-friendly comedy with major stars like Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward, but executives saw a special spark between Tuesday and a co-star named Dwayne Hickman. Convinced they could cash in on that chemistry, CBS cast her in The Many Loves of Dobie Gillis. There, she played a character who was one of Dobie's many love interests, though behind the scenes she and Hickman couldn't stand each other. He found her unprepared and rebellious. She found him self-absorbed and clueless about real life. Furthermore, Tuesday's antics were a little too hot for the show's sponsors. In one particular scene with a young Warren Beatty, their on-screen flirtation took a turn that made advertisers squeamish. The network dropped her after just one season, sensing that Tuesday was too scandalous for a squeaky clean sitcom. That abrupt end might have spelled doom for a lesser talent, but Tuesday had a knack for staying in the spotlight, even if it meant forging ahead in more questionable projects. Allied artists snapped her up, and at 17 she found herself starring in Sex Kittens, Go to College, a film widely considered dreadful, even by B-movie standards. In a move to boost sales, the studio filmed some extra adult footage involving dancers and a robot then spliced it into a special version shown in theaters aimed at mature audiences. That meant Tuesday Weld, still under 18, was unwittingly starring in a borderline X-rated feature. As if that wasn't enough, her next film, The Private Lives of Adam and Eve, raised eyebrows for using biblical themes in a risque story. The Catholic Legion of Decency condemned it as blasphemous. The UK refused to give the film a certificate, effectively banning it from standard cinemas. All of this cemented Tuesday's reputation as a bad girl, someone who was unafraid to handle controversial material. She was a far cry from the typical wholesome teen idols of the day. Plenty of starlets in the 1950s and 60s played high school girls, but Tuesday gave them a raw, jaded edge that clearly came from her own lived experiences. Meanwhile, her personal life only added to the intrigue. She had a habit of being romantically linked to much older men. According to rumor, Frank Sinatra was one of her conquests. She also reportedly dated George Hamilton and Raymond Burr, among others. By the time she was 16, she was seeing John Ireland, a man nearly 30 years her senior. Her mother, appalled by these age gaps, tried to intervene, but Tuesday had all the leverage. She was paying the bills. She told her mother to back off, or else she would quit acting, cutting off the family's income. At 16, she moved out of her mother's home into her own place. This was unheard of for a teenage girl in the early 1960s, but Tuesday was not your typical girl next door. She showed up at interviews barefoot, partied with Hollywood's elite, and spoke openly about her taste for rebellious behavior. The gossip columns had a field day, and the public was simultaneously scandalized and fascinated. In many ways, Tuesday was decades ahead of her time, embracing a bohemian independence that would later become more common in the late 1960s and 70s. Some might say she anticipated the free spirit of that later era by half a decade. Her acting continued to evolve. In 1961, she starred in Return to Peyton Place, playing a young woman dealing with deeply disturbing family issues. Critics started to notice that despite her chaotic personal life, she had real acting ability. There was a sensual, carnal vibe to her, but also something raw and emotionally honest. That same year, she landed a role in Wild in the country opposite Elvis Presley. Both Tuesday and her co-star Hope Lang reportedly fell for Elvis, who was already a megastar. Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's controlling manager, panicked when he heard Elvis might be spending time with Tuesday Weld, whose reputation was borderline radioactive. In Parker's mind, Elvis needed a squeaky clean image, and Tuesday was anything but wholesome. He pressured Elvis to end whatever flirtation existed, fearful that her notoriety would tarnish his golden goose. Tuesday was disappointed, but not devastated. This sort of controversy seemed to follow her everywhere, and she often handled it with a sense of defiance and humor. Then came a famous near miss. In 1962, Stanley Kubrick offered her the role of Lolita in his film adaptation of Vladimir Nabokov's infamous novel. Given Tuesday's well-known persona, it seemed like a logical casting choice. But Tuesday declined, quipping, "I didn't have to play it. I was Lolita." Sue Lyon took the role, and the film garnered critical acclaim and multiple award nominations. Meanwhile, Tuesday's star power began to sputter. She wasn't getting the best offers, and her private demons hadn't loosened their grip. Fed up with unappealing scripts, she took a break from Hollywood and retreated to Greenwich Village, hoping to find a form of personal peace and perspective. Something about that break seemed to work, because when she re-emerged, she began landing higher-profile parts. One of her big successes was The Cincinnati Kid, 1965, starring Steve McQueen. She earned recognition for her portrayal of a more layered, mature character, proving that she wasn't stuck playing teenage seductresses forever. Another major leap forward came when she starred in a TV adaptation of Arthur Miller's The Crucible alongside George C. Scott. Critics praised her nuanced performance, and many realized that her turbulent childhood, once seen purely as scandal, had actually given her an emotional depth rare for actresses her age. By now she'd adopted the stage name Tuesday Weld for good, leaving Susan Kerr Weld behind, at least officially. Around that time, she also tried to settle down in her personal life. In 1965, she married a screenwriter named Claude Hartz. They had a daughter named Natasha, and for a brief moment it looked like Tuesday might embrace domesticity. The marriage didn't last. They divorced in 1971. She partly blamed her mother, who apparently disliked every man that Tuesday ever took up with, even after Tuesday had left home. Shortly after the divorce, Tuesday returned to the screen in a black comedy called Pretty Poison, 1968, opposite Anthony Perkins, whom she'd befriended on a previous project. The filming process was fraught with tension, especially between Tuesday and the inexperienced director Noel Black. He gave her baffling notes, like telling her to think about Coca-Cola as a motivational cue. Tuesday became exasperated, eventually instructing the director to relay everything through Perkins instead. She later called it her worst performance, though the film itself became a cult classic. Unfortunately, its release coincided with the tragic assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy, so audiences were in no mood for a satirical story about violent young people. Still, Tuesday was resilient. Over and over, she showed an uncanny ability to bounce back. Directors kept inviting her to read for roles. Though she rejected quite a few iconic parts, she said no to True Grit, 1969, which went on to net John Wayne an Oscar. She also turned down Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice, 1969, and Bonnie and Clyde, 1967, famously claiming that they would be too successful. She seemed averse to mainstream blockbuster movies. Whether that was out of genuine artistic principle or her desire to avoid bigger spotlights is open to debate, but she sure missed out on some high-profile vehicles. In 1975, she again shocked people by refusing the Rocky Horror Picture Show, a musical that has since achieved legendary cult status. Things turned around somewhat in 1972 when she starred as a disillusioned ex-model in Play It As It Lays, based on Joan Didion's novel. She co-starred again with Anthony Perkins. The role felt like a mirror of her actual life. She was playing a woman in a crumbling marriage, a B-movie actress, overshadowed by bigger names. She poured a lot of her own raw experience into that performance. Critics applauded her work, and she landed a Golden Globe nomination for Best Actress. It was an affirmation that, for all the rumor-mongering around her, Tuesday was the real deal when it came to talent. Her biggest critical success arrived in 1977's Looking for Mr. Goodbar, where she played the sister of Diane Keaton's character. The movie was edgy and unsettling, exploring sexual freedom and danger in a way that was revolutionary for mainstream cinema of the era. Keaton had just become a sensation after her Oscar-winning role in Annie Hall, and that spotlight brought more attention to Tuesday as well. She earned an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actress. People started viewing Tuesday Weld less as a scandal-plagued curiosity and more as a formidable actor with a flair for complex, emotionally intense roles. In her love life, she seemed to continue her pattern of dating famous men, including a short-lived romance with the extremely handsome Richard Gere. But it wasn't just fleeting love affairs. She married the comedic British actor Dudley Moore in 1975, and they had a son together. Dudley Moore was known for a bumbling comedic style. Films like 10, 1979, and Arthur, 1981, made him a global name, but the marriage didn't stick. They divorced in 1980. Not too long after, Tuesday tied the knot with violinist-conductor Pinchas Zukerman in 1985. At first glance, that union seemed wildly different from her earlier Hollywood relationships, an alliance with a more highbrow figure from the world of classical music. Yet their marriage was also doomed. She later said she didn't want to hear another note of his violin, implying that their lifestyles were incompatible. In 1988, the couple made an unusual real estate purchase. They bought a house in Montauk, formerly owned by Norman Keane, a Broadway producer who had committed a horrifying murder-suicide in that very home. Keane attacked his wife with a blade before leaping off the roof to his own death. The property sat on the market with a grisly reputation, yet Tuesday and Zukerman bought it without hesitation. She seemed uninterested in superstitions, though that house caused them one headache after another. Years later, long after their marriage had crumbled, Tuesday tried to sell it. The dark history still put off buyers, so it languished unsold, forcing her to drop the asking price by around $2 million. The death of her mother in 2001 brought a complicated mix of emotions. Tuesday had often told people her mother was already dead, trying to shrug off any inquiries about their relationship. But once her mother actually passed, Tuesday admitted that she felt strangely liberated, though not necessarily grief-stricken. Their dynamic had been toxic from the time she was an infant, overshadowing every personal choice Tuesday ever made. With her mother gone, she might have found a sense of freedom, but she also hinted that she still felt haunted by her mother's presence. That haunting was literal in one sense. Her mother wrote a memoir called If It's Tuesday, I Must Be Dead, scheduled for release 2 years after she died, telling the story from her own perspective. Some people mockingly labeled it Daughter Dearest, referencing the infamous Mommy Dearest by Joan Crawford's daughter. The entire fiasco showcased the permanent rift between Tuesday and her mother, laid bare for the public to consume. The complicated mother-daughter dynamic wasn't the only swirling rumor around Tuesday in her later years. Whispers spread that she might have bipolar disorder, citing her mood swings and the extremes of her behavior. Others whispered that she dabbled in the occult or had ties to mystic practices. She's never confirmed such rumors, and in truth, many celebrities face bizarre conspiracy theories. But Tuesday's entire persona, mysterious, provocative, and unconventional, seemed to fuel every possible kind of speculation. Meanwhile, she had slipped into a lower-key existence by the end of the 1980s, opting for fewer roles but still appearing in the occasional film or television project. She popped up in projects like Author, 1982, with Al Pacino, and she also showed up in the 1993 thriller Falling Down, starring Michael Douglas. One of her final roles came in 2001's Chelsea Walls, directed by Ethan Hawke. That same year, she decided to officially leave Los Angeles and retreat to Colorado, craving peace and silence after decades of media storms. For nearly 17 years, she lived away from Hollywood, presumably focusing on a calmer, more private life. Rumors abounded about whether she was truly retired or just waiting for the right comeback. Then in 2018, she reportedly returned to the Los Angeles area. Whether that meant a fresh start or just a new place to call home was unclear, but fans couldn't help wondering if Tuesday Weld might unexpectedly appear in front of the cameras yet again. By now, you might feel like you know Tuesday Weld a bit more intimately, but she remains in many ways an enigma. She never wrote a tell-all memoir. She rarely cooperates with big interviews or documentaries. Much of what we know is pieced together through old articles, rumors, quotes from co-stars, and scattered references. That might be exactly what she wants. Her reluctance to be fully in the spotlight has only enhanced her legend. She's a kaleidoscope of identities, child breadwinner, scandalous teen, rebellious actress, cult icon, mother, wife, rumored sorceress, possible recluse, unlikely survivor. Thank you for diving into the extraordinary life of Tuesday Weld. If you're craving more stories about Hollywood legends, shocking scandals, or the private battles of the stars you only think you know, be sure to stick around and check out the next video. There's always another chapter of old Hollywood drama waiting to be uncovered, some tragic, some triumphant, and many just as surprising as Tuesday's. So stay curious, keep exploring, and I'll see you again soon with more deep dives into the wild histories and hidden truths of Tinseltown.